Everyone is currently talking about the Iran, Israel, and United States of America war that's happening in the Middle East, but very few people understand the historical context in which the geopolitical conditions that we see today were brewed in. So this video today is going to be us going through the history of Iran and US relations and seeing how we got to this point right now. To understand the history between Iran and the United States, we have to go back to the 1900s. At this point, Iran was called Persia, and it didn't exist as the Islamic Republic that we see today. It was an enormous country sitting on an insane amount of oil, an abundance of oil, but it was oil that it didn't control. It was controlled by the British. In 1901, a British businessman, William Knox D'Arcy, negotiates a consensus with the Iranian government. He negotiated the right to search and extract oil from Iran, and the Iranian government would be given 16% in future profits as well as £16,000. By 1913, oil had been discovered and the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was created. It was later named and turned into British Petroleum, what we know now as BP. And the Iranian oil was used to power British navies. So now obviously with Iran's oil being used to power the British Navy, it's now become a military resource and a military asset to the British Empire. Let's fast forward to 1941, World War II. At this point, Iranian oil is in control by Britain as well as the Soviet Union, but Iran is getting close to Germany. And the sitting Reza Shah at that time, you could call him a king, Reza Shah, he was seen to be cozying up with Germany, and that worried Britain and the Soviet Union. So they invaded Iran, removed him and forced him to abdicate his throne, and gave the throne to his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, who was 21 years old at the time and inexperienced. So he became like a shadow puppet for them and their interests. This is when we see America coming into the Iranian history and into the picture for the first time. So because America was a close ally, was on the side of the Allies during World War II, Iran became a supply corridor for the US. And this is the first time that we see Americans on Iranian soil and having access to Iran's supply corridors as well as their oil. After the war in 1951, something extraordinary happens in Iranian history. They have their first democratic elections, and Mohammad Mossadegh becomes the first democratically elected prime minister in the land of Iran. And he had very big visions for Iran. He studied in France and Switzerland, he wore ties, he was educated, he was a Democrat, and he wasn't what you would see today as your typical Iranian leader, or what you would imagine your typical Iranian leader to look like. He campaigned off of the idea of nationalizing Iranian oil and making Iranian oil Iranian again. And that's exactly what he did. In 1951, when he came into power, him and his parliament voted to nationalize Iranian oil, and it was the first time in over 50 years that the oil in Iran belonged to Iranians. And this decision obviously angered Britain. Now we're seeing the Anglo-Persian company completely removed from British hands and placed into the hands of the Iranian people, and this causes chaos. Britain immediately issues an oil embargo on Iran, ordering other countries not to purchase Iranian oil, not to send tankers, even went as far as taking the Iranian government to the International Criminal Court of Justice, in which they lose the case. And when all of these efforts failed and the Iranian government was still prosperous, they called on Washington. In 1953, the CIA and MI6 launched a joint operation, a covert operation called Operation Ajax, where they basically prepared and planned to overthrow the democratically elected leader Mohammad Mossadegh via a coup and take control of Iran. They bribed Iranian politicians, paid military officials, got Mossadegh supporters to go into streets and incite violence and create chaos, basically to get the people of Iran rioting and uprising against him. On the 19th of August 1953, the coup officially happens and Mossadegh is arrested in his home. He's then trialed by a military tribunal and sentenced to 3 years in prison, and he spends it under house arrest. He was placed under house arrest until he died 14 years later in 1967. The Shah, the 21-year-old the British Empire installed as king 12 years earlier, is now put back in power and is basically a puppet for Western interests in Iran and in the Middle East. Next 26 years, the United States of America give him money, they give him power, they give him resources, weapons, diplomatic cover, and in return, Iran stays pro-Western with oil flowing out and into the West. The Shah then creates a secret national police force called SAVAK. And SAVAK is not just supported by the CIA and America, they are trained by them, as well as Israel's Mossad. So SAVAK learns CIA and Mossad's interrogation tactics, the brutality tactics, their surveillance networks, as well as surveillance methods, all for the purpose of keeping the Shah in power. For 20 years, SAVAK tortures people, it arrests political leftists, political Democrats, anyone who had opposing views to the Shah or believed in regime change within Iran was arrested and tortured and killed. Thousands were killed under the brutality of SAVAK. And this is a part of the Iranian history that no one really talks about when discussing the 1979 revolution, is that the SAVAK was so oppressive on the Iranian people, their beliefs. It killed any political thought that was not aligned with the Shah. It repressed people. The human rights violations that were seen at the time were catastrophic. At this time, because of how intense the killings were and the political repressions was, there was only one organization that was able to withstand the SAVAK, and that was the religious clerks and religious leaders under Ayatollah Khamenei. In 1979, mass uprisings occur throughout Iran. The Shah is sick with cancer and does not have US backing anymore, and essentially a revolution erupts from the country. And that revolution births the land that we see today and the regime that we see today, the Islamic Republic of Iran. And after the 1979 revolution, we see the United States lose their strategic partner in the Middle East, Iran. And overnight, that relationship went from being an ally to being an enemy. The historical context that has birthed what we see today between the US and Iran's relations is very deep and very multifaceted. And I hope this video helped you understand a little bit more. I'm Chloe Maluleke, and this is IOL. Stay tuned for more updates.
Yesterday, we took a deep dive into the history of Iran and how we got to where we are today. Today, we're going to look at the aftermath of the 1979 revolution and what life looked like for ordinary Iranians living under the regime of the Islamic Republic. This is where it becomes a little bit tricky and complicated to dissect and look at Iran, because two truths can coexist with any system. Unfortunately, the Iranian people were oppressed by their government after the 1979 revolution. Thousands have been executed, and there's many stories on social media as well as documentaries that showcase the atrocities that were experienced and the human rights violations that are experienced by the people of Iran and their cry for intervention. At the same time, the manner in which the West, your United States of America, your Israel's Western media have portrayed and depicted Iran, as well as tried to interfere with Iran's politics, as we saw earlier in yesterday's video with the coup, and as we've seen now with the bombings of Iran and the killing of their supreme leader, is a violation of international law. This video is a complicated video because we are going to be holding two truths at the same time. The truth that the people of Iran were oppressed by their government and wanted regime change, and the truth that it's not up to other leaders of other nations to determine what regime change looks like in a sovereign state. My hope for this video is to shed more light on what international law looks like in practice and the violation of international law, as well as just highlight how we can help nations and people of nations facing oppression, at the same time respecting the frameworks that exist to ensure that we don't see countries be invaded by bigger countries off of them profiting from it, and in terms of regime change because they don't like the systems that govern those countries. It's now 1979 in Iran. The Shah has been removed and he's fled the country to the West, And Ayatollah Khomeini, the first supreme leader of Iran, is back in the country after 15 years living in exile. 5 million people are gathered in the streets to celebrate the coming home of Khomeini. And this crowd is a mixed crowd. There are Islamists in the crowd, there are liberalists in the crowd, there are feminists in the crowd, there are Democrats in the crowd. The people of Iran are gathered as one people under one banner and one hope that they finally have their freedom and their country back after 27 years of brutality. Unfortunately, as many of us know and have seen in history throughout the stories of Iran and throughout the documentaries about Iran, the Islamic Republic and the Supreme Leader's new constitution that now puts the Supreme Leader as the head of the country, above the president, above parliament, above judiciary, and he is the head of the country who only answers to God. We've seen how this ushered in a new wave of brutality to the Iranian people. From the late 1990s to as recent as January this year, Iranian people have been in the streets protesting and marching for regime change and marching for change within their government and with the experiences that they have in their land. This is now the backdrop that the West is using for their brutal attacks on the country of Iran. They're arguing that they are helping liberate the Iranian people and give them their land back. However, bombing and airstrikes is not a way of liberation. It is adding onto the problem and adding onto the devastation that the Iranian people continue to face. Alongside this, bombing Iran during peace talks in Geneva, bombing an elementary school that's killed 180 schoolgirls in the city of Minab, assassinating a sitting sovereign head of a nation is not justice. Under international law, these are all acts of war targeted towards a nation that did not declare war or strike America first. When a powerful nation does this, it not only violates international law and bypasses and weakens institutions like the United Nations, it fragments the world and the powers that are at play and how we relate to power in an international order. It tells every country watching that international order is not law, but merely a suggestion that applies to some and not to others. But here's what I need most of us to understand beyond legality. Does this actually free Iranian people? The Islamic Republic is not just Khomeini. It's a 47-year-old system that is rooted deep in economy, in military, in judiciary, in mosques, and in the very fabrics and foundations of the country that we see as Iran today. Whoever's put in place as Supreme Leader now would have watched the assassination of the previous Supreme Leader, Khomeini. They will likely be more hardened and less diplomatic. And the Iranian people, the same people who were dancing, the same people who were mourning, will be the same people living under the same brutality and the same system. Except now that system is traumatized, that system is militarized, and that system is now surrounded by chaos. When we look at the history of the US's intervention militarized tactics, all we see is a stream and a line of chaos. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein was removed and ISIS emerged. In Libya, Gaddafi was removed and we saw 14 years of civil war. In Afghanistan, after 20 years of war, $2 trillion spent, the Taliban was back in 11 days. Removing the leader in ways that break international law does not remove the system or regime in place. It only ushers in a season of chaos and instability that ordinary people are left to deal with. And in this case, the same people that Trump and Netanyahu are parading around saying that they're trying to free and liberate will be the same people left in the destruction of their work. The Iranian people have been living in the intersection of catastrophe for the past 47 years. On the one hand, they have a government that they want liberation from and freedom from. On the other hand, they have a Western world that claims to be wanting to help them liberate themselves, but adds more chaos and terror to their situation. The hope of the 1979 revolution was real, and the betrayal of that hope was also real. The violation of international law through the actions of Trump and Netanyahu is also real. But the Iranian people and their grief and their pain is also real. They deserve a world that finally figures out how to help them. My name is Chloe Maluleke, and I hope this video has helped you understand the complexities that exist within the Iranian story. This is IOL, and stay tuned for more updates. To understand American presence in the Middle East, you have to understand one word: oil. After World War II, America emerges as the most powerful country on earth. And that country understood one thing: that in order to control the global economy, you have to control the flow of oil in the Middle East. And this isn't because America itself needs that oil, but it's because every other industrial economy on earth does. And this is because if you can control who has access to Gulf oil and on what terms, essentially you can determine the economic fate of every powerful major country in the world. And this is the logic that follows behind the US's presence in the Middle East. It's not ideology, it's not a clash of civilization, it's energy and the control of it. And the military infrastructure that America has built across the Middle East over the past 80 years is not a response to terrorism or to any particular leader. It's a physical manifestation of the architecture of control that it's trying to build in the region because of oil. A detail most people don't know is that the US presence in the Gulf predates any modern conflict or any modern terror that we know today as justification. The first permanent US infrastructure in the Middle East was the US Navy in 1948. This is the year the Cold War ended and the year that Israel was founded. It was a small US naval task force that operated outside a former British base in Bahrain. By 1971, when the British formally withdrew from the Gulf, the US formally released out this base from Bahrain. By 1983, President Ronald Reagan creates the United States Central Command, CENTCOM. It's headquartered in Tampa, Florida, and it's in charge of overseeing 20 countries, from Egypt in the west to Pakistan in the east, from Kazakhstan in the north, and the Horn of Africa in the south. And the overall mission and aim of CENTCOM is to ensure US interests abroad. When you read the CENTCOM documents of the 1980s, they're very honest and frank about what US interests actually are. One is the uninterrupted flow of Gulf oil. Two is freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab al-Mandeb. And finally, it's the security of pro-American governments in the region. This has nothing to do with democracy, nothing to do with human rights, but everything to do with the flow of oil. Let's walk through the US presence and its pattern in the Middle East, starting with Afghanistan. On the 11th of September 2001, we have the 9/11 attacks in America. The Taliban government in Afghanistan are found to be harboring Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. The US then demands that they are handed over, and the Taliban agrees to hand them over through a third party. The US refuses, and then it goes ahead and invades Afghanistan. Now, this invasion echoes a similar sentiment to what we're seeing with the Iran attacks and invasion. The US didn't have a clear-cut plan when invading Afghanistan. General Tommy Franks, who coordinated the invasion, later on admitted and came on to say on public record that they really didn't have a plan in terms of what happens after the Taliban is removed from Afghanistan. The invasion itself was planned meticulously, but the days after were just to be improvised. After this, the US builds 800 military bases in Afghanistan. It props up a government of its choosing under the gaze of democracy. And the people of Afghanistan, they don't believe in this government because they understand this is a foreign-led government. And after 20 years and $2 trillion, the GDP of France, the US effectively withdraws from Taliban, and 11 days later, that system and that government that they propped up and created collapses, and the Taliban comes back into government and power. In 2003, we see a similar situation with Iraq, but slightly different because the US thinks that they're justified because they believe that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction under Saddam Hussein, which is proven to be untrue. Paul O'Neill, who was President Bush's secretary at the time, came out and publicly stated that the invasion in Iraq was because of oil. O'Neill described maps being passed around of Iraqi oil infrastructure and conversations and discussions being had in terms of which foreign oil companies will take control of which infrastructures. The war was already planned before the justification followed. Libya in 2011 is a little bit more complicated. Unlike Iraq and Afghanistan, there's already an uprising amongst the people of Libya for their freedom. The US Security Council passes Resolution 1973, which authorizes member states to take all action necessary to protect Libyan people. It is the only time in modern history that the responsibility to protect doctrine, the international legal principle that sovereignty has limits, when governments massacre their own people, is actually ever evoked, with Security Council approval. NATO effectively intervenes, and the rest is history. Libya doesn't have a formal government for the next 14 years and is basically thrust into chaos and destruction. These examples are not to say that the US wants chaos. The US wants control, and in order for them to have control, there has to be instability. Now, Iran is different from all these countries that I just mentioned as an example because Iran's institutions run deep. Their systems have existed for 47 years and are deeply entrenched into the economies, into the fabrics of society. Iran is the one country that the US has been trying to control for the past 73 years, but also the one country that has been preparing to go to war with the US for the past 47 years. The US has spent decades invading independent sovereign countries, spending trillions of dollars on military operations, and lost thousands and thousands of lives. And in every single one of these cases, it's the people who feel the aftermath. It's the people who are left in the chaos and destruction and are left in the rubbles of their own home. This is the pattern, and it's all in the name of oil. I'm Chloe Maluleke, and stay tuned to IOL for more updates.